All right, we are delighted today because we've got Ginny Roth on the show. Ginny is, well, first of all, Ginny's a colleague of ours. She's a deep personal friend, but also the reason why we wanted her on the show is because she's become, at least for me, I'm going to call her my Pierre whisperer, my Pierre Poilievre whisperer. Whenever I need to make sense of what's going on with the conservative movement in Canada, she's my go-to because she knows the ins and outs. She also was director of communications for Pierre Poilievre's leadership campaign, and she also is a much better Tory than I am. She's much more aligned to the cause than I tend to be. I'm a convenient Tory at
I'm not
times,
sure
so
Tory is actually the right word in this case.
it's true, right?
Being a better conservative in Canada is in some ways the opposite of being a Tory, but we'll
That's
have
true.
that debate at
Ooh,
another.
ouch, ouch.
And so, well, welcome to the show, Ginny. We thought it'd be good timing to have you on because there's obviously a lot of international interest in what's going on in Canada. And there's a lot of international interest, it seems, in Pierre Poilievre himself, naturally, because, I mean, unless things change dramatically, he is currently on course to becoming our next elected prime minister. And so I thought it'd
It's
be great to
elected.
have you. Yes. I
It's
mean,
strange
elected by the
concept these
people, I
days,
should
right?
say.
Yeah. What an
Um,
odd concept.
what an odd concept. So we thought it'd be great to have you on the show so you can help break this down for us. We have listeners now. We have international listeners. So there's going to be some people who are not nearly as familiar with Pierre Poilievre as let's say some of our Canadian listeners. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is such an honor.
So, yeah.
She's a charmer. She's a
She's
charmer.
a charmer. Okay, well let's start. Poilievre has generated, as I said, a lot of international tension, and for our international audience, Ginny, I think it'd be great if you can give them the 101 on how Pierre Poilievre got to where he is, the trajectory he went on, how he went about winning the leadership and commanding what seems to be a lot of support over the last couple of years, and how that trajectory has occurred. So why don't you break it down for us if you
Sure.
can?
Sure. There's a lot to this story, so I will try to keep it relatively concise. As people probably know, Justin Trudeau became prime minister in 2015 with a sort of sweeping majority that was movement-like in its broad-based appeal. And this came at a time where Canadians were quite economically comfortable. You might even say that we were almost decadent about our position. And he got elected because he was committing to things like electoral reform and cannabis legalization, the kinds of things you can commit to when you have a lot of economic comfort. People were not worried about the elements of life, the basic elements of life as they are today. And that can be hard to remember. We also put off in the following years, because Trudeau was elected in that context, as the UK went through the Brexit debates and Trump was elected in the US, this kind of undercurrent of economic malaise, nationalism, populism, Canada kind of put off. It wasn't that these undercurrents weren't growing in Canada, they were. But with our system being what it is, the Liberals in subsequent elections, despite their vote share dropping significantly, was able to cling onto power, first in the form of a small majority, much smaller majority, and then in the form of a minority and being propped up by our Socialist Party and the NDP. And so the Liberals, over the course of that almost decade, that 9-year period until now, have been able to govern quite confidently and command the confidence of our Parliament without commensurately maintaining the support of the public. In the meantime, all kinds of things happened. The Conservatives had a couple different leaders. Conservatives take an approach which I think was ill-advised by trying to ape the Liberals, basically trying to be inoffensive, trying not to rock the boat, being frankly apologetic a lot of the time for conservative policies, particularly on social and cultural issues, and just not putting up a fight, not pushing back on a lot of the assumptions that were baked into the lines of questioning in the media, the consensus in elite institutions, etc. And so by the time Aaron O'Toole lost the last election, Pierre Poilievre was really set to emerge as someone who is the opposite of that. Like, this is a guy who never takes an assumption without challenging it if he thinks it's worth being challenged. He never accepts the premise of a faulty question. He's always bringing the fight. He also, when he decided to run for a leader, we were kind of at the tail end of the COVID pandemic in Canada. The restrictions were, for many Canadians, just totally over the top and getting kind of ridiculous. And because the Conservatives under Aaron O'Toole were still so scared of their own shadow, they were really, I think, scared to push back against that. And Poilievre emerged early in the leadership as an aggressive voice against those restrictions and symbolically against the excesses of elite institutions and their overreach. So first it was COVID restrictions, then it was aggressive attacks against the CBC, left-wing state broadcaster, And that grew and grew and grew. And then it became against, homeowning boomers and NIMBYs who wanted to, and the municipal leaders who are elected by them, who want to have zoning restrictions that restrict housing supply. And all of these sort of like sacred cows were being gored. And what Poilievre was finding, or what he intuited and turned out to be correct about, was that the public was right there with him. And I think we'll get into this later, but importantly, it was a different kind of coalition than the Conservatives had built under previous successful leaders like with Stephen Harper. And so even before he ran for the leadership race, he also, and I think you noticed this, Joseph, was very prominent on social media. He understood the algorithms and the various platforms and what kind of content did well on those platforms. For instance, he was posting long form YouTube videos long before anyone realized that that was compelling content. And he was building this very committed group of followers. He was also prosecuting policy arguments before they blew up in the public. So inflation, it was like Pierre Poilievre and Larry Summers were the two people talking about inflation being caused by runaway government spending and not just the war in Ukraine long before anyone else.
But he was doing that in language that the public could understand, right? Which is the incredible thing about it, is just, explaining a really difficult concept like inflation, but in language people can relate to, which
that's exactly right. That's
same with the quantitative easing and all the rest of it, right?
Yeah, the stylistic point I think is really important. He's incredibly thoughtful about the words he uses. He speaks only in plain language. He actually tries to insist on using Anglo-Saxon words, not Latinate words, words that really resonate. Yeah, that if you're a marketing professional and you're marketing, down market beer instead of upmarket wine, you're going to market it in Anglo-Saxon words. This is actually an Orwell and Churchill concept that he really takes to heart and actually he's gone even further than that and committed to. This is under discussed because it's probably not that popular to that many people, but I think it's important to him. He's actually said he would bring in a plain language bill in Parliament to force the bureaucrats and public servants to write in language that is actually accessible to everyday people, so that when you read an Orwellian bureaucratic form, you don't have to guess at what it means or try to decipher it. It will actually just be in plain language. So anyway, that's an aside, but I think that was important as well. And then, of course, he won the leadership campaign by a huge, huge margin, bringing in not only new online young conservatives, but also sort of old stock Harper conservatives. And that, I think that perch, winning the leadership by so much, gave him a lot of room and credibility with his caucus to then go into Parliament and day in and day out prosecute the case against carbon taxes, in favor of housing supply, against crime policies that let people out on bail too early, against experimental drug policies that have been kind of ruining urban centers across Canada. And in so doing, he's now created this message set that's been really resonating with voters across the landscape in Canada.
I wonder how much of his appeal. I'm going to come back to, I actually went door knocking in a nomination race for one Rick Roth, actually, who you may know, Ginny. For our listeners, that's Ginny's husband, who ran. And I was struck at, so it was for the nomination. And so, of course, we're going door to door and we're trying to talk with party members who would be the ones choosing their next candidate. And I'd never experienced this before, where door knocking, almost every single person we spoke with was a brand new member of the Conservative Party. And the reason they were brand new members because they found Pierre Poilievre's message so compelling in like sort of that mid-pandemic era, particularly when he was talking about freedoms and personal freedoms. And I get the sense now, a couple of years later, as I'm talking to people, at least out in my neck of the woods, that because he was able to speak on a topic that people felt so passionate about and felt that shook them at their core, he was using language in which they said, this guy actually understands me. Finally, there's a politician who actually like sees this the same way I do. And I feel that's created a gateway now where those same people probably weren't necessarily at the time thinking as much about inflation or about housing or all these other things that they're now thinking about. But I think the reason why they're thinking about it is because they found him so compelling. They're paying attention to what he has to say. He's talking about these issues. He's doing it in a way that's very crisp, clear, and easy to digest. And then as a result, they're going, yeah, first of all, he's my guy. He validated that by coming out at a time when it was not very popular to do so in favor of personal freedoms in the pandemic. Now that I know he's my guy, I'm going to listen to what he has to say on these other issues. And because he's my guy, I'm inclined to believe what he says, and I'm prepared to adopt that as my own view of these things. What do you think there's something there, Ginny, about this whole gateway concept, about the way he communicates and demonstrates values alignment?
Yeah, I think that's totally right. There's like two things I would add to that. One is the credibility enhancing piece of, in my lifetime, pre-Polyev, we were sort of like, we reached a point of peak issues management in politics where the influence of issues management, which there's nothing wrong with taking an issues management approach to politics and trying to, particularly if you're a government, trying to be able to focus on the issues that matter to you and deprioritize or take off the table the ones that don't. But that art of issues management had so taken over politics that politicians, so much of their communications was about not saying anything or avoiding saying something. How do I get away? How do I get out of this interaction without saying anything? Was sort of like the art of media training politicians, building out issues
Okay.
management teams. In many ways, I think that your candidate in BC there, Kevin Falcon, kind of represents like the peak of that era of politicians. If I can just sort of sit in the middle and be inoffensive and avoid saying anything, then maybe I can win. And I think the public had so much fatigue at that. And so, to your point about credibility and building trust, Polyev very much cuts through that because he frankly refuses to say anything. He won't issue a press release or put out a statement that doesn't say something. And because if it doesn't say something, well, then what's the point? And I think that style of communication, it's obviously subconscious. I don't think people are analyzing it in this way, but I think it builds so much credibility with people who start listening to him for the first time and think, I don't really like or trust politicians, but I think I like and trust this guy. Combined with, I totally agree on the pandemic. I think it's very important that when he came out against some COVID restrictions, it was still unpopular, particularly in the op-ed pages of the Globe and Mail amongst sort of the chattering classes. And in fact, he was quite attacked for it at the time. It required someone quite strong-willed to sort of stick to that, even though I think it was covertly popular among the regular people in Canada who were sick and tired of all of it. And that kind of being in tune with the politics of the moment and understanding where people sit, but also being willing to step out a bit and take some risks and lead public opinion and lead on an issue and be the first one out on an issue. He actually, I think, has shown that throughout his whole political career, and it has been a huge difference maker for him. I would argue the same thing on the carbon tax. It was not so long ago in Canada that the absolute consensus, every pollster would tell you, you cannot get elected in Canada without a serious climate policy. A serious climate policy must involve pricing carbon, and therefore everyone's got to be in favor of the carbon tax. The issue's over. Well, I mean, clearly that was not true.
And you even had conservatives arguing that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Most conservatives, I would say.
But what we've had for a generation, right, or two of politicians is followership, not leadership, right? And I think it was Maggie Thatcher who said, someone must say the unsayable. And it's incredible, like watching Pierre say these things on, particularly on like drugs. I mean, sitting here in Vancouver where, the issue is just like, when I watched his videos, I was like, oh, at last somebody is actually saying the stuff on, because, up until that point, it was all about, harm reduction, safe supply and all this stuff where, clearly, but you look around and everyone must see none of this is working. And all of a sudden you have a leader who's saying the unsayable, and a lot of people are waking up and going, oh, actually, yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
But I suppose my question is, how do you walk that fine line there between saying the unsayable and just looking angry? And that's, this is the challenge, right, for people, because it's very easy to, we hear a lot about the angry young men that there are in the world today. And it's that, but he seems to have navigated that quite well thus far, right, of not looking angry whilst also saying things that are outside of what was the political consensus at the time.
Yeah. I don't think those two things are necessarily in conflict, because populism at its worst is just being a follower, not a leader. Followership, as you say, not leadership, where you're just sort of constantly got your finger in the wind. You want to have constant rolling issue polls and just be slightly behind public opinion at all times, right? And that I don't think was the case on the matter of drugs. I think on the issue of drugs and drug policy, it's a very good example of, I don't know if the public knew what it wanted. I think the public intuitively felt its cities were in disarray and crumbling. They were maybe a number of years ago, open to experimental policies because the issue has so many tragic outcomes that it feels like, gosh, nothing's working. We've got to try something. And Poilievre, he tends to, when he analyzes an issue, apply principles first, like first principles first, then politics after. And politics being a gate, I think there are some issues where he may say the public's not ready yet for what is the right policy on this. So I'm going to sort of gradually get them there. And I won't go out on a far limb on this until I think the public's ready to be open to that argument. But on other issues, he may say, I think the public's unclear about what they want. I think they intuitively probably know what's right. I'm going to do a lot of research and data. And by the way, actually, I think that's a better way to put it. It's principles, then data, then politics at the end. And the politics is sort of the gate against all of that. And I think that's how he landed on his position on the drug issue. And then once he has the confidence that the principles are right, the data and evidence is there, and that there is an openness politically to this argument, then it's all in on persuasion mode. And in many cases, he's proven to be right. I'm sure you could think of instances too where he's tried a given approach and it hasn't landed terribly well or hasn't been all that salient and he's moved on. I think you have to be willing to iterate as a politician. But I think that the way you guard against vacant populism or just angry populism where it's all emotive and not substantive is that principles first, then data and evidence, and then a hard political analysis, a hard-nosed political analysis sort of at the end.
So we should probably get into, because I'm just intrigued by this, because actually one of his senior folks said to me last July at some event in Toronto that, the voter coalition he's put together is very similar to the Boris voter coalition, right? Which from completely different backgrounds, they managed, but actually still both characters are people who are seen to say things that are unsayable, right? Because the problem with Boris was he'd also say things that were really unsayable, and he probably shouldn't have said. However, the voter coalition, and she said to me, look, we put the same voter coalition together and we're still getting used to that. So probably, like, before we talk about where we are now, given some of the polls, it probably, I just think, good to go through what is the coalition that's consistently been putting, for people who are not in Canada, consistently been putting the Tories at 40 to 45% now for well over a year, right? Maybe two.
Yeah. Well, I think it's useful to talk about the Anglo sphere and then also to talk about Canada specifically. I was just reading a great blog post. Well, I'll take an even further step back. I was at an event hosted by the Hub with Oren Cass, where the backdrop to a lot of that conversation was about Trump's coalition and the new rights coalition in the US, which has changed. It's more working class, it's younger, it's more multi-ethnic than the old, clubhouse Republicans. In fact, highly educated upper middle class people have moved to the Democrats. That's sort of all the Democrats have left. Obviously, Boris post-Brexit replicated a very similar coalition in the UK. I think in the UK, class dynamics play an even bigger role. You saw working class Northern England voters moving to the Tories from Labour in a way that you hadn't seen in some time, which you could speak to much better than I can. And what's interesting is Trump has kind of held that coalition together in the US, and in fact, he's leaned even further in that direction from his original voting coalition. And in the UK, the Tories and their split with Reform, I think, reflects the falling apart of that coalition. Not permanently, but I think today that coalition is quite split. Those sort of working class voters who may be economically not all that right-wing, but who are culturally pretty right-wing. They tend to be sort of like anti-woke, and they have common sense values, pro-family.
Patriotic, all the usual.
Patriotic, exactly. Tough on crime, all those factors, tough against immigration, a bit more nationalistic, etc. But they want their union jobs protected. They may want the state to be involved in spending and statecraft in order to build communities, that sort of thing. Those voters tend not, I think they tell pollsters today, they're broadly not interested in voting Tory. They might be voting Reform. They've
gone Reform, right? They've gone Reform. Yeah, they haven't gone back to Labour, their traditional base, right? They've in big numbers gone to Reform.
That's right. I think because much like the NDP and the Liberals in Canada and the Democrats in the US, Labour in the UK is obsessed with culture issues and being anti-right-wing on culture issues, and they can't win those voters back on that basis. So in Canada, I think Poilievre, to your first question, Joseph, should be a super interesting leader for Anglosphere conservatives from around the world to watch. In Australia as well. There is this question of can Poilievre hold together this new coalition? In Canada, I think the overarching feature of change is age. This Poilievre voting coalition is shockingly young. So young relative to conservative voting coalitions of the past. And it is young people who have less trust in institutions, who feel economically much more insecure, who do not own a home, who feel reticent to start a family, and who feel critical of the status quo, who say maybe we should tear a lot of it down. And I think that's why you hear a lot of anger in Poilievre, by the way, because he's reflecting back that genuinely held anger that those young people are feeling. And there is also this sort of class dynamic. There are voters for our Ontario listeners, Southwestern Ontario, in parts of suburban Vancouver and exurban Vancouver, who are multi-ethnic, young, working class people who are more culturally conservative, tough on crime and common sense, and who on economic issues, frankly, I think they're not quite sure what they want. There are moments where they want the state to intervene. There are moments where they might want their union rights protected. They don't love fiscal hawkishness for the sake of it. They don't think the deficit should be reduced in a certain number of years, for instance. I think they think government should be smaller and more effective, certainly. I think most people, I think that's a common sense value, but it's not a traditional fiscal conservative set of issues or language.
It's not ideological.
It almost seems to me like what's made him so effective is that he's been able to clearly communicate that he has practical solutions to some of these problems. Mm-hmm. And because they are practical, they're not necessarily ideological, mm-hmm. right? Like I feel like to be a conservative in the 80s, like you subscribe to a core set of principles. Suddenly you're a free trade, or you wanted to cut down the size of government. There were things that you sort of held on to. This voter coalition that he's assembled seems to be much more disparate in mm-hmm. its composition. And to your point, you've got like, he's appealing to blue collar union workers at the same time as he's appealing to eggheads on economic policy, at the same time as he's appealing to like young parents who just want to mm-hmm. get a home or pay off their mm-hmm. bills. And to me, there's not like, I'm going to sound like such an egghead now, but I'm not so sure there's a clear Pierre Poilievre doctrine. Is there? Or am I wrong on that? Doctrine, who uses that fucking word these days?
I think inherent in what you just described are challenging contradictions. The UK Tories are facing these challenging contradictions. You had in Truss and Sunak, I think, prime ministers who had to address serious economic problems and who brought more doctrinaire Tory or right-wing economic perspectives. They you could argue didn't tackle some of the more nationalistic concerns like lowering immigration, etc. And so that coalition, quite the opposite. And they increased immigration, exactly. And now their credibility, speaking of credibility, they've got a credibility challenge on that issue, right? And in the US, you have Trump who is pushing past those normative issues harder than even he did the first time around. And it remains to be seen whether Trump starts to alienate the more traditional part of his coalition. He's got people around him who represent American business and the interests of American business. And the new tech right. But he's also got people around him who represent the interest of the white working class who don't want to trade with China because no amount of low prices is worth it for them to see the hollowing out of their manufacturing sector. But these things run up against each other. And you've seen Poilievre have to confront some of these challenges and policy choices he's had to make. His party, I wouldn't say they supported, but they allowed to pass a piece of legislation that would ban replacement workers, so further empowering unions, to the great dismay of a lot of Canadian business, and not just, woke Bay Street business, but like regular business who extract things and need to ship them across the country and can't allow for labor disruptions. So these are genuine conflicts, and when you're in opposition, they're easier to avoid. Those conflicts are much more difficult to avoid when you're in government. And I think we'll transition to this part of the conversation, when you have a foreign threat and disruption the way we do today in recent weeks with Trump challenging Canada on a number of fronts, you suddenly don't have the room and the comfort to delicately navigate those contradictions. You may be forced to have to pick a side on some of those issues. And maybe I'll just finish this thought by saying, I do think deep down Poilievre is a free marketer. I really is. He grew up in the era of exactly what you described, just around free trade and free markets and the power of the market. He, I think in his heart of hearts, deeply, deeply believes in the power of a dynamic market, particularly when you remove taxes and protectionism and red tape and you empower the market to grow and create wealth and those sort of things. And so I think on most issues, he defaults in that direction. He is, though, sensitive to other factors like patriotism, nationalism, our borders, our safety, new technology, etc., all the things that make us have to consider how markets play out in our current world.
And he does understand in his gut, I think, doesn't he, that, for a certain sector of the community, who you are is what you make, right? That's everything. So, if you're, those blue collar workers, whether you're a steel maker, car manufacturing, that is who you are, your community, you as an individual, right? And that will rub against some of those more free market, which is the thing with Boris, right? Boris just in his gut understood that steel workers in Scunthorpe made steel, and that was who they were, and that's why he ploughed £150 million into a plant, because they get that. But that goes against those more traditional conservative.
A simple economic model would not reveal that important fact, right?
Not quite. Definitely get into the whole issue of where the polls are at the moment, right? I mean, we've had this 40 to 45%, 20-point lead. Some of the polls at the moment seem to be suggesting there's been a slight change. How worried should Conservatives be about that?
I mean, putting aside how worried Conservatives should be, there seems to be a real shift. What I would say is, first, I think it's an open question how real the previous lead was. I mean, Trudeau was clearly a massive damper on the Liberal numbers. There's no question. And so lifting him off those numbers, I think it was inevitable the Liberals would get a boost. The Conservatives, I think, benefited from that environment. They benefited from not a lot of external change in the issue environment that they had to respond to. And so that high, I think most Conservatives on the inside who are sort of planning for the next election were not banking on that kind of a lead. And the polls seem to show that today the Conservatives would still win a majority government. So the key strategic imperative now is to maintain that space, to make sure that there is room for the Conservatives to win a majority government. I think it would be difficult for Conservatives to govern with a minority in Canada. And so a win looks like a majority in my mind. And there's plenty of room to do that. And the other factor I would add is I think Mark Carney, who seems to be the likeliest choice for Liberal leader, this is the best possible position he's ever going to be in. He's faced zero scrutiny. He's really not put much forward. And so he is a vehicle now for anyone who wants to consider another option. They can sort of park with him.
You can project onto him,
They
right?
can project onto him whatever they want. That's right.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, everyone's been reporting Poilievre's sort of last week, his messaging, what he's been focused on as some big pivot. I'm curious if you think it actually is a big pivot. To me, it just seems like a natural evolution of the issues that he was talking about. And now he's maybe doing it with a little bit more precision in the face of the tariff threat and to find a way to demonstrate how he would have responded if he was prime minister. So demonstrating as a prime minister in waiting, given if we believe the softening of the poll numbers, and I agree with you, like I think so much of what gave this massive lead to the Conservatives was just an outright rejection of Trudeau. Just so many people were just done with that guy. And either they were prepared to just say, well, fuck it, I'm going to vote Conservative, or I'm just not going to vote. And now they have potentially another option. They're prepared. Some of them are prepared to go Carney's way without the caveats that we've talked about. But I'm curious if you have a view on whether the Trump factor creates a risk for Poilievre. I mean, unfairly, I would say so many, at least the elites here in Canada, like to paint him with the same brush. They like to say Poilievre is just like Trump. And if there are enough people that believe that, big if, obviously, my concern is that people go, oh man, this Trump guy, we don't like him at all as Canadians. He's threatening us economically. He's a total asshole. This Poilievre guy going to be just like him. And does it suppress the enthusiasm that he may have had up to this point?
I think my answer is I don't know that people know what they want right now. There is the other piece of analysis I'd add to how I'm reading the current polling is I think there's a bit of a rally around the flag effect.
Totally.
Because you're seeing incumbent premiers, after all just suffering in an era, an inflation and post-COVID era that was really bad for incumbents, you're now seeing lift for incumbents basically across the country. And I think that lift is a sort of, my country is under threat, and so I've got to maybe rally behind my leaders in a way that previously I would have been less inclined to support them. I was kind of on the edge. Now I'm inclined to tip over on the edge of the direction of my governments because I want to rally around them as they face this scary threat. And I think people really are scared by Trump. Like if you watch the reaction of pundits, leaders, anyone commenting, there's this lighting there. People are lighting their hair on fire, and the reactions are very emotional. They're not terribly well reasoned. You're starting to see just this week in response to the steel and aluminum tariffs, a bit more willingness to just wait and see, which I think is a far better approach with Trump, by the way. And so my hope is, and I think this Poilievre, I wouldn't call it a pivot either. I would call it maybe a change in emphasis, a bit of a refinement. I think that is hopefully going to dovetail as the public hears more and more about what he would do in a way that's relevant to the Trump threat, dovetail with a view amongst Canadians that will coalesce around, hey, let's stop lighting our hair on fire. Let's be realists. Let's put the national interest first. and then working back from that, decide what the appropriate response is. And it's not a terribly it doesn't call for a moment to be partisan. It calls for a moment of leadership and statecraft and statesman-like policymaking. And so Poilievre, over the past week, it was an announcement on the border, an announcement on interprovincial trade, an announcement on the Arctic and defense spending. All of these announcements, by the way, I would bet my bottom dollar that they were already in his platform. He's now just pulling them forward and making them very relevant to the national conversation. And when people ultimately what he wants is, if people picture who can negotiate with Trump best, it shouldn't be someone who is going to bend over for the guy, but it also shouldn't be someone who is so offside and so ineffectual as to be incapable of actually standing up to him and having a real negotiation. And I think Poilievre has the opportunity to emerge as the obvious choice in answering that question.
Do you think the Conservative, and we've had discussions on this elsewhere, right, in some of these group chats and things, do you think the Conservative response has been the right response? Because a lot of the stuff that's been pumped, I agree with you, there's been a definite rally to the flag moment, and certainly that change, talking to some of the campaigns out here in Vancouver, which is obviously thinks a bit differently. It's been the doorstep reception has certainly been different to what it was before this. Do you think the Conservative response has been the right response? Because some of it has continued to be quite aggressive against the government and against Trudeau and Carney at a time when the public is saying, we want you all on the same page, it seems, in polling. So, I mean, and I don't know how you get that balance right without becoming irrelevant, because, you sit there and you're on the sidelines in a moment of national crisis like this, right? When you're the opposition, there is literally nothing you can do. And you can especially do absolutely nothing because the parliament of this country isn't sitting at the moment. But I will not rant about that yet again. But, has it got the balance right?
I just don't think you can opt out of that conversation. I mean, so this week we had steel and aluminum tariffs. You cannot let Mark Carney off the hook for first supporting a carbon tax, then now supporting a version of a carbon tax, which would be a tax on polluters. He did an interview a couple of weeks ago or a week ago saying, oh, don't worry, we can tax steel because they're heavy emitters because Canadians don't really use steel. To me, that's very relevant in this conversation. And so I think when you're attacking your opponents in the government or people who hope to lead the government, you have to make it relevant, certainly. And just talking about the carbon tax in a vacuum feels maybe not up to the moment. But there are ways in which the carbon tax is highly relevant to the moment, actually. We wouldn't be in this. There's so many elements of the position we're in and the weak position we're in, the weakness of our economy, the fact that the threat of a couple points hit on our GDP is so existential and earth-shattering is because we have totally neglected growing our economy for a decade. And so, I think the public has to be ready to hear that.
Yeah, I was just saying that's the thing, right? The public has to be receptive, and I'm not convinced they're receptive to that at the moment.
There's an extent to which, over the last, say, 10 days, they're I think, not going to want to hear that long-term plan message as much as they want to hear just
we're all together and we're
all exactly, emotional messaging around
Canadian, blah 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 blah.
But I just think Poilievre, through his whole political career, has been rewarded for leading, not just responding to the whims of the moment. And that means that there are points where you have to kind of white knuckle it a bit. And I would much prefer that white knuckle approach. First of all, he has always won when he's taken that approach. Second of all, it means that when you do win, your mandate is so much more meaningful. You didn't win because you aped the newfound faux patriotism better than the other guy. You won because people bought into the idea that we need a short, medium, and a long-term plan to restore the economy and negotiate with Trump from a realist mindset. And I think that is the kind of government I would want to win as a conservative.
Although I interestingly had a chat with a Conservative, and because I was thinking everybody would be thinking like me, because here I am in Vancouver, surrounded by fellow young, attractive, highly intelligent, early 30-year-olds such as myself, and that's why the mic's picking up a noise. But actually, I was talking to a Conservative MP in deep Conservative territory who said to me that the response they'd had was actually a bit of pushback on Pierre supporting the 25% tariffs, because what they'd had in some of their party members and thinking, well, actually, we thought he was different, and that this isn't, kind of, where the Conservatives are, which again just demonstrates that point of that broad coalition, right? You've got the union worker whose job under threat, and then you've got the free market Tories who are anti-tariff. So
it's not quite the same, Andrew. But I have a couple people in my network who, because the tit for tat response, a dollar for dollar response on the tariff issue, came from the Liberal government. There are conservatives in my circle who are just immediately opposed to it. Because, well, if it's coming from Trudeau's mouth, then it can't be right. Why is Pierre Poilievre is supporting this? And I don't know how fair that is.
A bad reason to, like, that kind of simplistic reactive partisan instinct would be a horrible reason for Poilievre to support that policy, and I would not endorse that. I do personally. I think counter tariffs are a bit of a, I don't know if red herring is the right word. I think, it's kind of cutting off our nose to spite our face. It would hurt us at least as much, if not more, than it will hurt the US. I think Trump thinks of us as like a flea on an elephant. And I'd much rather spend time thinking about renegotiating the terms of a new Canada-US trade agreement. But I think Poilievre is in a position where he has to balance the public's desire for a satisfying response that feels satisfying with a long-term plan that will actually get us out of this mess. And that's a tough environment to negotiate.
It's quite funny that watching the UK Labour government come out and say it won't be putting tariffs on in response to the US tariffs on steel and anything from the Labour Party, right? Because their argument they've made is we have a cross-party consensus in the UK in favour of free markets, and therefore, and I thought, I'm hearing this from a Labour minister. It just seems like a bizarre world.
Everything's been flipped upside down.
Everything is upside down, right?
So I should also say I hold out this hope that a lot of what Trump is trying to do is reformulate the geopolitical dynamics of the world in favor of a strong U.S.-led bloc that stands up to and opposes and shuts down China and its allies at every turn. And there are ways that Canada is not serious enough about that yet. I mean, on steel, as I understand it, we still have massive infrastructure projects that use Chinese steel. So to then turn around and say, how dare you do this to our steel industry, we're going to counter tariff you. I think we have to really get serious about shutting down all of those backdoors to China and then saying, okay, now let's have a really, really open North American, or at least Canada-US, integrated supply chain, free trade environment that can be a really, really strong counterpoint to those other blocs globally. That's the dream that I want to see. And so I think we have to be working in the national interest to pursue that. It's just, I'm not sure if the public is ready to hear that level of a sophisticated argument right now.
It's going to be an interesting time when, or if Pierre Poilievre does win. Just to close this out, Ginny, I'm curious. Obviously, everyone's got their views on what kind of leader he is, what kind of prime minister he will be. I feel like there are a lot of caricatures about him floating around, and that he's not always well understood. And one of the things that I've suggested to some people is what you may not know about Pierre Poilievre is the degree to which in any room he is exceptionally well briefed, and I would argue probably knows whatever issue he's being briefed on more than the person briefing him. And so I feel like he's, sure, he's a clear communicator, and that can come off as being simple in the way he digests information, but it's actually quite the opposite. He's incredibly intelligent and has figured out how to communicate that in simple terms. I'm wondering if you've got one thing that you feel people are getting either wrong about Pierre Poilievre or something that might surprise us about him as a leader.
I think the one that you described is very good, and I totally agree with it. It's rare to find someone who's both a populist and an intellectual, but he is that. And so I would agree with that. I also think there's this inclination to believe that ultimately the first thing conservatives will do will be the fiscally conservative things, like they'll go in and they'll cut, or there will be a lot of that. There will be a lot of reducing the size of government and trying to get back to basics and deregulating and all that. But because to our earlier point, because one of the uniting dynamics of this new coalition is cultural conservatism, I actually think a lot of the first moves will be around changing policies around bail and other criminal justice reform items to try to reduce crime. It will be around pulling DEI and a lot of the other sort of woke nonsense out of the apparatus of government. I heard Sean Spears say on The Hub last week that perhaps a feminist foreign policy isn't the correct response to Donald Trump. And I mean, there's an extent to which every department in the federal government has been sort of overtaken by this weird, like narrow ideology. And I think I think actually you may have, if the Conservatives are elected, a caucus and a cabinet that has very diverse views on economic issues, but very much a consensus on some of those cultural issues. And therefore, I think a lot of those things will be pursued first and with the greatest urgency, which people might not fully expect. Um, and what else would I say? Yeah, he is a reformer. He does not want to govern for the sake of governing. He does not think, well, the longer I'm prime minister, the longer I'm prime minister, the more the country will get used to conservatives, or whatever the sort of incrementalist Harper doctrine was, which, by the way, I think Harper himself is sort of questions whether that's right for this moment or whether he could have done more. Poilievre is a reformer, and I think his goal is to get in and make as much change as possible, as quickly as possible, in service of what he genuinely believes is right for Canada.
Fascinating.
Very fascinating. Okay, well, thank you. This was great. We've been accused, if you can believe it, even though we're both conservative co-hosts of this thing, we've been accused of not having enough conservative views on the show. So, Ginny,
Wow. Well,
Yeah,
this
I know.
should change that right quick.
We've only had conservative views on the show. I mean,
Not nearly conservative
Depends how you
enough, I've
define
been told.
conservative, Mr.
well, that's true.
Yeah.
Yes, I've been accused of not being a Tory by many Tories. So, but yeah, that's fascinating.
That's great. Okay, good. We'll have to have you back frequently, Ginny, to make sense of all this for us.
Thank you for having me on, gentlemen.
Well,
All right.
I mean, really, we're looking for a new co-host because it's not Joseph's not really cutting it.
We're
So
auditioning.
I think you and I could take this to levels that Joseph is just not possible to do, right?
It's quite true.